In so many senior positions at State, at Treasury, in the White House for that matter, over the years, it's not a surprise that your name comes up just about every other day for some position in the Trump administration. I can count 4 or 5 different positions you've been mentioned for, most recently the NSA. Do you have anything to tell us about that?
Well, those reports about the National Security Advisor were incorrect, David. If they were correct, I wouldn't have the pleasure of being with you this morning.
Okay, so the nation's loss is our gain, I think it's fair to say, Bob. So thanks for being here. So let's focus on an important job you had, number 2 at Treasury, because we have Steve Mnuchin now confirmed last week, coming in after some delay. Talk to us about what is on his to-do list.
Well, the first thing I'd say about Treasury, David, is it is the department, in my view, that is going to have the most active, consequential agenda in the near term. The very good news is that broad agenda is supported by a very professional and rather small bureaucracy. So the ratio of responsibility to bureaucracy is the best in government. And that is important because both on the domestic and the international side, Secretary Mnuchin faces daunting challenges. On the domestic side, I would say the first 2 are bank deregulation and tax reform. The outlines of what the administration would like to do have been laid out, but the details now need to come forward. What can be done by the administration, via executive action, what will require congressional legislation. On the international side, 1 month from today, Secretary Mnuchin will be leaving for his first meeting with G20 finance minister counterparts, leading up to that summit in Germany this summer. He'll also be meeting with his G7 counterparts. That's a very important part of the international financial system. He'll be playing a key role. And then also Treasury's role in the national security space has greatly expanded with its leadership of sanctions programs, particularly against tough countries like North Korea and Iran.
So Bob, that's quite an agenda, and it's an advantage to have a small bureaucracy in the sense you can be small and nimble. It's a disadvantage if you don't have enough people. And right now, he doesn't have, this is Steve Mnuchin, a lot of people surrounding him at Treasury as he takes his office.
Now, that is a concern, David. I would say the Trump transition was ahead of schedule in selecting its cabinet, and they're going through the very onerous confirmation process now, but the cabinet is just about in place. The concern that I have, both at Treasury and in other departments and agencies, is we have not yet seen the names of those important sub-cabinet officials, deputy secretaries, undersecretaries, assistant secretaries. And although there are relatively few at Treasury by comparison to Defense and State, he needs them quickly.
What do we know, Ambassador Kimmitt, about his role, specifically Mnuchin's role within kind of the Trump administration? Is he going to have the president's ear? How does he fit in with Wilbur Ross and some of the other players that might help him in getting his agenda done? Because financial regulation and tax reform, both 2 big projects.
Both Secretary Mnuchin and Secretary-designate Ross were among the first supporters of President Trump. They not only supported him during the campaign, they frequently flew with him to campaign events, were very involved in substantive preparations. I expect each of them and their departments will be very, very significant players on the broad economic agenda, both domestic and international. They will, of course, work closely with other departments and agencies, and importantly with the White House, especially the National Economic Council.
If you were advising him, what would you move forward on first? Would it be regulation in terms of the financial industry, or would it be tax reform?
The first thing that I would suggest is that he press the White House to approve his slate of sub-cabinet officials, to get them into the clearance process and get them confirmed as quickly as possible. Secondly, with the staff that he has, I would say, what can we do on bank deregulation, on tax reform, and by the way, on the international agenda, via secretarial or presidential action? Let's first do what we can do within our own authority. At the same time, please start preparing for me specific legislative proposals for changes in our bank regulatory laws, changes in our tax laws, and by the way, if we need additional congressional authority on economic and financial sanctions, let's do that. But I would first say, what can we do within our own authority to pursue the agenda that the president has laid out? But let's not forget that a lot of it will require both consultation and, in many cases, approval and action by the Congress.
So, Bob, you said the first priority is to get the White House approve those sub-cabinet positions. Does Steve Mnuchin today know who he wants in those positions, and what's holding it up?
I don't have a lot of insight information, but I think that both Secretary Mnuchin and Secretary Ross have a clear idea of the people they would like in those positions. Are certainly very short lists, but the presidential appointment process in all administrations with whom I've worked is a joint effort between the White House, Presidential Personnel Office, PPO is the acronym, and the departments and agencies. And of course, the White House is doing that across the executive branch. And so it does take some time to get through the screening, the vetting process. Remember, there was a lot of criticism that there hadn't been proper screening and vetting in some of the cabinet officials. I think the White House and the departments are trying to do it correctly. I think the key thing now is to get to decisions, get those names through the clearance process, get them up to the Senate for review and confirmation.
So, Bob, you mentioned the NEC, the National Economic Council. You've been in the White House. What is the role of Gary Cohn in this? How does this work out with Gary Cohn, with Wilbur Ross, with Steve Mnuchin? You have some very powerful personalities there. Can they all get together?
I certainly think they can. The National Economic Council was a creation of President Clinton. In fact, your next guest, or later, Dan Tarullo, earlier served on the National Economic Council under President Clinton. I think it was a great creation. It put the emphasis on the economic and financial component, particularly of national security policy, as well as the work they do on the domestic side. They will have to work together. And let me be candid, there is a tension. There's always a tension between the White House and the departments. And it could be either the NEC or the NSC, National Security Council. What we want to do is to have a tension, however, that is creative and productive, not personal and destructive. My impression so far is that these people are going to work in a way that does have a competitive element to it, but it's going to be a competition of good ideas that in the end will produce good results for the American people.
That's what I wanted to ask you. You say, that they do need to work together, Bob, but based on, your knowledge of these individuals and your relationships, will they work together? Will they want to do that? Kind of a common good, if you will.
I think they will certainly want to do it, and what I know of them, and candidly, I know them, but not well, but they are the kinds of strong personalities whom you want, people who have driven results in the past in the private sector. They need to bring those deal-making, results-oriented skills into the executive branch. When I was at the State Department, for example, I worked for Jim Baker. He was not only a terrific Secretary of State, he was also George H.W. Bush's best friend. But we had a strong Secretary of Defense in Dick Cheney, and we had a National Security Advisor, Brent Scowcroft, who was the President's trusted advisor. We didn't agree on everything. We had a nice competition, but again, it was a competition of ideas, which I believe in that Bush 41 term turned out some wonderful results, not just for the U.S., but for the world.